Welcome to The Explainer. We constantly hear that we're living in this era of globalization, right? A world where borders are supposedly becoming less and less relevant. But if you look closely, the reality is actually quite different. The world isn't just integrating globally, it's actually fragmenting into incredibly powerful regional teams. Instead of one giant borderless market, countries are strategically banding together to create exclusive clubs. Okay, let's dive straight in. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the rise of regional blocs, why countries integrate, the 6 stages of doing so, the big debate between regionalism and multilateralism, what this all actually means for business, and finally, the future of trade. All right, part 1, the rise of regional blocs, going from global to regional. Let's challenge this idea that globalization means a totally borderless world. To make this abstract economic stuff super relatable, I want you to think about something you literally use every single day. Grab your smartphone. Whether it says designed in California or anywhere else, how many international borders do you think its little components crossed before it actually reached your pocket? Let's track the completely wild, pan-European journey of a smartphone. It's the perfect way to see a regional bloc in action. So the brain, the main processor, might use UK-designed tech, but it's manufactured over in Germany. Then you've got the eye and ear, those super sophisticated camera and audio chips. They often come from specialized plants in the Netherlands or Belgium. Next, all these pieces are shipped off to assembly plants in Poland or the Czech Republic. There, they're wired up to screens from Slovakia, powered by batteries from Hungary. Finally, the whole finished phone is shipped to a storefront in France. But here is the absolute magic of this whole process. Along that entire crazy journey, there are literally 0 customs declarations or import duties applied at any border. None. That is the logistical superpower of a regional bloc like the EU. So what we just looked at is the result of a regional economic grouping, or REG for short. Basically, it's a formal agreement between 2 or more sovereign states in a specific geographic region. The goal? To promote economic integration by knocking down barriers to the cross-border flow of goods, services, capital, and people. Look, this isn't countries rejecting globalization. It's actually a highly strategic, managed approach to it. Countries are teaming up to compete better on the global stage. They're creating these massive insider advantages for themselves. Moving on to part 2. Why do countries integrate? Let's look at the political and economic drivers. Now, countries absolutely do not surrender their sovereign power by accident. It's a huge deal. So let's look at what's really driving this. It's a fascinating mix of politics and economics. Politically, believe it or not, the biggest motivation is often just preserving peace. Think about the European Union. They originally intertwined the coal and steel industries of historic rivals, France and Germany, specifically to make the cost of going to war unacceptably high. Other groups, like ASEAN, use integration for conflict resolution. Plus, pooling sovereignty seriously amplifies your diplomatic bargaining power. It allows blocs like the EU to set global regulatory norms, something we call the Brussels effect. Economically speaking, the hunger is all about larger markets. Integration boosts growth, it lets companies achieve these massive economies of scale that drive down consumer prices, and it acts as a giant magnet for foreign direct investment. All right, section 3, the 6 stages of integration. Let's climb Balazs's staircase. Okay, let's transition from the why to the how. How does this actually work structurally? Well, economist Bella Balazs brilliantly conceptualized integration as a staircase. You start at the bottom, step 1, a preferential trade area, where you just lower tariffs a bit. Step 2 is a free trade area, completely wiping out tariffs among members. Step 3, a custom union, adds a unified tariff wall against outsiders. Step 4 is a common market, letting both capital and labor flow freely. Then, step 5 is an economic union. This is where countries harmonize monetary policy, like, say, adopting the euro. And finally, the top of the stairs, step 6, full political union. This is the ultimate merger of sovereignty with a central government. As you can see, every single step demands nations surrender a little more independence in exchange for greater economic rewards. Now, taking a look at this graphical analysis from Jacob Viner, we can really see the immediate economic effects of taking those steps, especially in a customs union. He showed that integration creates brand new trade efficiency, what we call trade creation. You're replacing expensive domestic production with cheaper imports from a partner country. But, and this is the catch, simultaneously, it can cause trade diversion. That happens when the new unified tariff wall forces a country to stop buying from a highly efficient global producer outside the bloc and instead buy from a less efficient partner inside the bloc. It's totally a double-edged sword of efficiency and exclusion. So, when a bloc finally reaches that common market stage, it unlocks the 4 freedoms. That's the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. In the European Union, the engine making this a reality for 450 million people is the principle of mutual recognition. Basically, if a product or service is legal to sell in one member state, it's automatically legal in all of them. Think about the business implications of that. You can design a product for a massive, unified market, move your investment capital without any restrictions, and recruit top-tier talent across the entire continent without ever dealing with a single work visa. Part 4. Regionalism versus multilateralism. Welcome to the Great Trade Debate. Let's zoom out to the macro level for a second, because there's a fierce debate among economists about all this. Do these regional groups actually help or hurt global free trade managed by the World Trade Organization? The crux of it is whether REGs are building blocks or stumbling blocks. Proponents argue they're building blocks. They act as these incredibly useful laboratories where a few like-minded countries can experiment with really complex digital or environmental rules, stuff that would be virtually impossible to get all 164 WTO members to agree on. But critics? They argue they're stumbling blocks. They point out that overlapping agreements create what's known as the spaghetti bowl effect. It's basically a nightmare of red tape, contradictory standards, and rules of origin that actually end up fragmenting global trade and disproportionately hurting small businesses. Section 5, the real impact on business, winning the insider advantage. So how do these big theoretical frameworks actually play out in modern corporate strategy? Well, one of the most fascinating tactics is tariff-jumping foreign direct investment. Multinational corporations will literally drop billions to establish factories inside a regional bloc. Why? Simply to bypass that common external tariff we talked about. For example, Japanese and American automakers historically built these massive plants in the UK just to gain preferential, tariff-free access to the entire European Union market from within. They essentially buy their way in, transforming themselves from outsiders into insiders. But it's not all smooth sailing. This creates a really distinct geographic challenge known as the core periphery problem. Because capital and people can just move freely, economic activity, big investments, and skilled workers naturally tend to gravitate toward a highly developed central core. And sure, this centralization offers massive economies of scale, but it leaves the periphery, the less developed outer regions, super vulnerable. Local firms out in the periphery often just can't compete with the giant corporations sitting in the core. This leads to deindustrialization, and their best talent just leaves in a massive, damaging brain drain. Finally, Section 6. The future of trade, looking beyond traditional goods. As we look ahead, the very nature of trade is evolving way beyond just physical cargo on ships. We're seeing a massive rise in digital trade agreements. These focus on cross-border data flows and digital commerce, not physical goods. On top of that, geopolitical shifts are radically altering corporate strategies. The old-school model of just finding the absolute lowest-cost supplier, that's being rapidly replaced by a desperate need for supply chain resilience. And that brings us to friendshoring. This is the strategic regionalization of critical production. Businesses are under huge pressure right now to align their supply chains with political allies to mitigate systemic vulnerabilities. They literally have to treat geopolitical risk as a core component of how they design their supply chains. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. As these regional economic groupings become larger, more deeply integrated, and way more strategically aligned with geopolitical allies, will these powerful blocs eventually replace globalization altogether? Are we looking at a future world economy entirely run by a handful of regional megateams? It is absolutely something every business leader and frankly every consumer needs to keep a very close eye on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped map out the incredibly complex, yet totally fascinating regional world we live in.